Welcome back to the show, folks. Great to have you here. We have an amazing episode for you today with a fantastic guest. But of course, before we jump into that, a little bit of housekeeping. Number one, I want to thank all of you guys for showing up week after week, for your comments, for your questions, for the incredible reviews. They're really, really helpful. They're heartwarming. They keep me going. And they also help more people to find the podcast, which ultimately helps me to get more guests and more of these amazing guests for you guys that who we can learn from. So that's number one, is a thank you. Number two is an invitation to join me on my newsletter. If you go to natnidham.com, at the top of the screen, you'll see a red bar that says sign up for Nat's newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter. And these days, when you sign up for the newsletter, you get a 7-part email series on preparing your body for more advanced biohacking strategies, such as bioregulator peptides. And bioregulator peptides, which, by the way, increasingly you're going to be hearing referred to as amino acid complexes. And that has to do with a lot of different reasons that I'm not going to get into in the intro. But at the end of that 7 email series, you get a table with all of the names and origins of all of the different amino acid complexes out there. So if you're interested in this area, and even if you don't know what an amino acid complex is and why you should care, that 7 email series is going to teach you, hopefully give you a lot of insight into a lot of the work that I do with people when I'm coaching to help them get their systems up to speed so that they're ready for the more advanced stuff. In this longevity episode, I chat with functional mental health expert Brendan Vermeire to discuss tracking physiology when it comes to mental health. We dive into societal pressures around food and alcohol, the impact of social media on mental health, and the need for nuance in health discussions. We also discuss the role of inflammation, neuroendocrine dysregulation, nutrient status, as well as neurotrophic factors in mental health disorders. Now, if this all sounds like Greek to you, don't worry. Brendan is amazing at breaking things down. We also highlight the need for objective lab testing and how that can help to track physiological function and, bottom line, get to the bottom of what might be going on. Brendan Vermeire is a wonderful human being. He has an incredible story of his own. He is a mental and metabolic health scientist and researcher, functional medicine educator, as well as a board-certified holistic health practitioner. He founded the Metabolic Solutions Institute for Functional Health and Fitness Practitioners, and he's created innovative tools like the Mental M.A.P lab panel and the Functional Mental Health Practitioner Certificate Program. So Brendan's dedicated to advancing the science of mental health through his not-for-profit foundation and educating healthcare professionals on integrative approaches to mental well-being. So you definitely want to connect this guy if this is a topic that is near and dear to your heart. You can go to his website, which is metabolicsolutions.llc.com, as well as you can connect with him on Instagram, which is at _holistic_savage. And his podcast is The Holistic Savage. Now, let's jump into the episode. Hey, folks, just a quick reminder that all of the information presented in this podcast is for information purposes only. No medical advice, no diagnosing, no treatments suggested here. Before you try anything that you hear about or learn about here, make sure that you check with your medical provider. Welcome to the show, Brendan Vermeire. It is a total pleasure to have you here today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, my friend. I'm excited we got to hang out in Vegas a little bit. Now we're going to be doing some podcasting, share some information with the world. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And actually, you guys, you need to understand something about this man. Like when we talk about, quite apart from having a beautiful personality, one of the things that really struck me when we got together in Vegas, and this is not something I could have done, we went out to dinner together with a couple of other people who introduced us, and Brendan was not eating that night. And so here we are at this really nice restaurant, and there's beautiful food on the table. And this man just sat and what did you drink? Water.
Yeah.
I think.
Water.
I think you drank water. Literally drank water, said no to all the food. I was eating my food, kind of looking at him going, wow, that's super impressive.
I forgot about that. Yeah. Well, there's all those restaurants in the Venetian Palazzo, and I was hooked on, I forget the name of that kind of Latin restaurant, but I was so full and I was in the mood
Mhm.
that night too. So everything you're saying so far, I'm like, oh, I'm glad I didn't come off like a jerk that night.
No, I mean, I guess there's two camps, right? There's
Yeah.
the people that would be like, seriously, you're out to dinner with people. What do you mean you're not breaking bread with us? And then there's the other camp, which is me, which is like, impressive. You can
Uh,
stick to your plan.
so you're my kind of person then, because I'm always that guy. Like even I was, with my colleagues in New York, and after dinner they all wanted to go to a bar. Like they're Irish, they like to drink. I don't like to drink, so I'm the one standing there not drinking, and then people are like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "No, I'm great. I just don't want to drink or eat." Apparently.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of these crazy societal things, right? I mean, and it's funny, I mean, this is a different tack altogether from our topic, but I know that it's going to get there. And this whole idea of the societal pressures on people to drink alcohol and to, and then there's the other piece of eating as a way to come together, which I think that in and of itself is it's a different beast, but the alcohol piece is massive.
Hmm.
And I do think it's starting to take hold in a different way. Like I don't know about you, but I know in restaurants where I live, we're seeing bigger and more elaborate lists of cocktails that don't have alcohol
Hmm.
in them. And so, which, half the time they're still full of sugar and stuff you don't want to be drinking, but there's an effort being made.
Hmm. Yeah, there is. I am enjoying it. I think we live in a very pleiotropic society in times, and everybody kind of has their preferences. But I'm glad to see diversity of activities and everything. Diversity makes for a more stable ecosystem or
Yeah.
sociological ecosystem. And these days, with like, okay, cannabis is less stigmatized, and psychedelics or mocktails, and so it's like, the point is to energetically connect in a way that's
Hmm.
fulfilling and meaningful. The mechanism by which we connect is kind of asinine and superfluous and doesn't really matter. So teach their own, right?
Yeah, 100%. And look, we didn't connect any less that dinner because you
Yeah.
weren't eating.
Yeah.
As long as there's acceptance, then there's no issue.
Exactly.
So, all right. So your zone of genius, and I love, like, tapping into people's zone of genius. Your zone of genius is this whole area of mental health
Hmm.
and how it connects to metabolic health, the microbiome, which of course you can't talk about metabolic health without talking about the microbiome. Before we started recording, we talked about the M&M, mental health, microbiome, and metabolism. And I know that I don't know, I know that you have a very powerful story of your own in this whole space that really brought you into this and allowed you to kind of lean in a different way. So, I mean, we don't have to delve too deeply in there, but if you wanted to just kind of set the stage for why you do what you do, and because you do it beautifully, I have to say, like
Thank you.
your content is spectacular. I'm always amazed at, like the posts are so eloquent and articulate, and I just love reading your material.
Well, shoot, that means a lot to me, my friend. The brilliant content creator in me sees and honors the brilliant content creator in you. It is just all very passion driven, and it's a weird feeling. Like these days, I've got so many things going on with my career and my personal life, and even in some ways, I feel like I'm going through this new metamorphosis transformation period right now. A lot of things are kind of falling apart or falling into place, and so sometimes I have to remind myself of like, how did I even get here? And there is, this long, super tragic, sad story that really kind of transplanted me on this path with my own mental health struggles while, I was a personal trainer and nutrition coach. So, metabolic physiology was just like what I was really into. I didn't care so much for trying to coach people on healthy eating habits or guiding them through workout or teaching them how to squat. Like that's not so exciting for me. But I just really loved the science of the human body and the science of human health. But then meanwhile, struggling with my own mental health. And that turned into a intentional overdose suicide attempt and going
Mm.
through the intensive care unit, the inpatient psychiatric ward. So I experienced firsthand just how dysfunctional the conventional approach to psychiatry and mental health really was. Went through, a really toxic, unhealthy, destructive relationship, and that ended with a lot of betrayal and emotional abuse and manipulation, and she ended up taking her own life years later.
Mm,
So like these are
wow.
just like cliff notes, right? And this
Yeah.
is,
They're intense though. I mean, they're defining,
yeah,
right?
they're very, very intense cliff notes. It's like that. I went through it. I chose to go through it. I learned a lot of lessons through it. And along the way, it was really trying to navigate my own mental health struggles. But I'd actually would say it was me more so trying to save my at the time fiance, who was struggling with some kind of mysterious debilitating illness that nobody could figure out. No
Mm,
alternative, naturopathic, chiropractic, conventional, nobody could figure out what was really wrong with her. And she had it wasn't just like a psychosomatic kind of thing. There was something very intense going on with her physiologically, wasting away on, physically and cognitively, becoming very just volatile in demeanor. I mean, and to this day, I really don't know what was plaguing her. I have my theories of, maybe too many concussions from cheerleading, and maybe we were living in toxic mold, unresolved trauma, as I'm sure anybody in the
hmm.
functional biohacking space can appreciate. Illness and pathophysiology, it's never just one thing. It's the
No.
compilation of many, root cause factors and input signals that are perturbing their physiology, and therefore then also their psychology and their demeanor and their aura. So it was all navigating all that put me on the path of functional medicine. And I did kind of get excessively niche down into the mold, Lyme, complex chronic illness world, which I think by conventional mainstream standards would really be considered more like fringe medicine. But
Hmm.
within our space, like this is the heart of like the most complex types of chronic illness to try to navigate. And when I was growing up, and I was really active in martial arts and wrestling, and all these kind of combat tough guy sports, they always say like, well, once you've wrestled, everything else in life is easy, or the only easy day was yesterday, and all this tough guy stuff, right? And it's kind of like that with complex chronic illness, of like, if you can learn how to navigate those types of cases, everything else just feels easy and like a walk in the
Yeah.
park. But I don't know. I've just been forging my own way, and somehow we've landed here. So I just really enjoy being able to talk to other people and getting this message out there. And especially in a world where I feel like social media is getting worse and everything's becoming grotesquely like oversimplified and,
Yeah.
binary, black and white. So I love the medium of podcasts where we can actually explore these things together. It makes
Hmm.
me feel a little less crazy.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm with you. I mean, the nuance that we're losing nuance, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's the old, and you see it over and over again, the old strategy of clickbait.
Yeah.
What can I say that's going to grab people's attention? How can I deliver a message in 2 seconds flat so that it's not too much for people to consume?
Hmm.
And if you follow those two rules, you've essentially diluted whatever value was behind the intention of the content to a point where it's pretty much useless. As you say, it becomes, is it good? Is it bad? It's one of the questions that drives me the most nuts is, oh, well, then this is good, or, oh, and this is bad. And I'm like, well, it depends,
Hmm.
it depends on a million factors. And so, and the impact I think that social media has had on mental health, again, is dual. On the
Hmm.
one hand, it's brought much more attention to it. It's allowed people to share their experience. But on the other hand, I think that social media is a massive driver
Hmm.
of poor mental health in so many people. And particularly, I think we're seeing it so much in youth, like in
Hmm.
kids. This this need for perfection, this need to always be happy, this need to to always the filters, and now the filters aren't even enough. Now we're seeing young women, and I don't know how prevalent it is in young men, but with the fillers and the Botox in their 20s. And it's frightening because it's nothing but a slippery slope. Who
Hmm.
knows where it's like, I don't know what the next level is, but it can't be good. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, but coming back to mental health and how it's become so prevalent now. It's and again, it's a chicken or the egg thing. Is it more prevalent than it was before, or is it just what are your thoughts on this? Do you think there's more of it than there was, or do you think that there's less taboo around it now, and so people are just more open about their struggles?
I think it's both. I think it's getting really weird. I think it's getting really blurry. I think social media and this constantly changing algorithm isn't really helping anything, right? I like that's why I like your content so much. It's technical, it's dense, but it's broken down in a digestible way. Like because I can't stand seeing the trends, or even lately. I tend to do a little bit of a walkabout, but I always bring it full circle because, like, even right now, we're seeing this trend of now all the influencers are just jumping on it because it's that me too, got to follow
Mm.
the trend because that's what's trending. That's what, penetrates the algorithm. So now, it's this sort of cry of false vulnerability of, well, social media is not real. Here's all the things that I'm struggling with. And just
Oh,
everybody's jumping on that bandwagon,
I
and it's
saw
like
that.
this is part of, in my opinion, this is part of the problem with mental health. Is it's a lot of external validation seeking behavior under the guise of vulnerability, and it's not even true. Vulnerability is like somebody's, like crying or on the verge of crying, and they feel safe enough to like be vulnerable energetically and everything. It's not like projecting, this stuff for the sake of like, I don't know. I just, the social media culture wears me out. I do think we have more technology, more data collection strategies. So we have more just epidemiological data on mental health disorders and prevalence these days in the age of AI and document everything. So there is just more screening and more data. And at the same time, there are very real challenges psychologically, sociologically, and physiologically that are pretty unprecedented. So I definitely, when you look at more disease outcome data, I think about things like Alzheimer's as the sixth leading cause of death for Americans, right? The reality is, at least, speaking as an American in America, Americans as sort of this petri dish monoculture population, of being the epitome of oxidative stress, inflammation, chronic
Hmm.
disease. So, it's unfortunate that my country is serving as, sort of this experimental sign for the rest of the world of like, okay, don't do it this way because this drives chronic disease and national debt. I mean, the cost of healthcare is crippling. And what's a little bit odd too about like the space that you and I work in is it's a different demographic. Most of the people that follow you or
Yeah.
me or consume our content, um, you know, I want to make sure I'm polite and constructive with what I say because look, if you're a health enthusiast and it's entertaining to do all the functional medicine protocols and testing and biohacking, like if that's what you enjoy, but how much of it is really necessary for just having good health? And then meanwhile, like 99.9% of the
Yeah.
population has really no concept of really good health. So it's just getting really, really weird.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that trend because I do find, maybe the first person who put up that post, this is what I'm struggling with right now, was genuine,
Hmm.
right? And then somebody saw it and said, "Oh, wow,
Yeah.
that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
I'm doing that." And to me, ironically, the minute I see something that's a trend, I'm like, "Oh, I can't jump into that.
Yeah.
Like I can't do it, right? Like this I just I it makes me feel really fake,
Yeah.
right? And so it's interesting, and I mean, no disrespect to all the people who've jumped on with all the best intentions of the world, because to many, in the best view of that of that trend is, if nothing else, is to highlight to people who seem to see people always happy, always shiny, always put together, always doing the right thing, bringing them behind the curtain, saying, you know what, actually, this is not my reality. The
Mm-hmm.
reality is that I don't always work out every day. I
Mm-hmm.
don't always put on my blue blockers at night. I don't always meditate when I'm supposed to. Like, I just don't always do these things. I do my best and I try, but, hopefully we're able to communicate that on an ongoing basis instead of just putting up the big post. But, you mentioned Alzheimer's, and we were talking earlier about neurodegenerative diseases, and I talk a lot about longevity and health span. And at the end of the day, the bar is, what do we want? We want to live longer and healthier. We want to be kicking ass in our 80s and our 90s, even our I'm too close to 70 to say in our 70s, because for me, I'm like, well, I'm still going to feel the way I feel now in 10 years, so I'm not including that. But definitely we've raised that bar, and so if we want all that, then it behooves us to say, okay, well, what can we do to prevent what can we do to prevent the onset of these diseases? In some cases, maybe the ship has sailed, but I do think it's never too late to start. And maybe let's talk a little bit about the role of, that big word that means so much, that chronic inflammation, that is affected by metabolic health. It's affected by the balances or imbalances in the microbiome, and eventually translate and translocate really into the brain, and express as what are these devastating conditions that
Mm-hmm.
really will put an end to those dreams.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's a huge subject, and it's something I've spent years kind of going down all these different rabbit holes and getting up to date with all the research, and it's a painful process to wait for some of that to start circulating and becoming a little bit more mainstream and commonly talked about. And there's just way too much myopia and overcomplicating healing and
Mhm.
health, right? And a lot of it is very kind of sales oriented. I remember years ago, because it has shifted a lot over even just the past like 5 years, where I think back to when I kind of first got on Instagram and was trying to establish, like, what am I doing on here? What am I trying to put out, and whatever. And in our space, like, everybody kind of has to have their thing and their niche, because, like, how boring would it be if all of the health influencers were all just saying the same thing over and over and over, of like, we'll get outside and get sunlight and get sleep, and we'll exercise and drink water and eat healthy food. If that's what all of us were saying all day every day, and that's all the content we put out, like, that's boring, it's redundant, people don't want it. But then what happens instead is, like, we overcomplicate and we over niche down, and then our followers are following us down these, at times, like, theoretical or excessively myopic reductionistic rabbit holes, and then we're kind of losing sight of, like, well, just the main things that you need
Mhm.
to do. Like, health is actually amazingly simple, right? And when you look at, like, COVID had a lot to do with this too, but I think when the population is kind of under the illusion of, like, oh, well, it's so complicated, and then consuming all the content but not integrating
Sorry.
it, and before you know it, it's like, well, I think there's a sort of subconscious psychological bypassing of, like, I know the things I should do, to be healthy, and I'm not doing those. But then maybe if I buy, I mean, hell,
Yeah.
today I put up a post about curcumin being studied as a potential treatment for Alzheimer's. A big part of what I try to do now, whether people pick up on it or not, I don't know, that's up to them. But, like, I'm a mechanism guy. I like research. I like mechanisms, and whether it's a pharmaceutical or a peptide or a nutraceutical, I honestly don't really care. It's a
Mhm.
matter of, does it modulate the mechanisms potently enough to have some sort of clinical efficacy and impact? And of course, our society has been so heavily conditioned to reach for the pill for the ill, because that's convenient and that's easy, and we all know that. And there will always be a market on that, right?
Yeah.
But a big part of what I strive to do, even if I am maybe, let's say, promoting a supplement that I endorse, I believe in, I take myself, I've done the research, but also it's like, okay, all those free lifestyle behaviors, right? If you can identify, hey, this fancy new drug or this supplement or this peptide or this therapeutic, it works and it works well, and we have the data to support that, and here's the mechanisms that it modulates. Okay, well, guess what? We can modulate all those mechanisms by changing your environment and changing your lifestyle. And that's just free information you can give away. So, I feel like, I guess the point I'm getting at, in today's weird world of consumerism, you kind of have to sell people what they want and do like a bait and switch of then to give them what they need, right? Like maybe the selling point is bottle of curcumin, but you're also kind of subliminally delivering like, well, but you also need to exercise and get sleep and get sunlight. It's just amazing the lengths that we have to go to try to convince people how
Yeah.
to do things that are healthy for them, things that we didn't have to think about in more ancient civilizations where no, just that's how life was, and we were forced to do those things that are good
Yeah.
for us.
I agree. I mean, I think that there's a couple of things there. I think also to make note of is number one, I think the first thing is, you can't optimize a body that's out of balance,
Mm-hmm.
right? And to get your body into balance, it's a lot of what you're saying, right? It's the foundations. And I know that I feel like a broken record. Like I'm writing a presentation for a conference I'm speaking at next week, and I'm like, am I really going to say this again? Like people are going to throw rotten tomatoes at me,
Mm-hmm.
but I guess we do have to keep repeating that. And I think the selling point that I use, that I'm sure you lean into as well, is if you do these other things, these really boring things, you may not need the supplement. Or if you do use the supplement because you have an inherent imbalance in your system, it's going to work better
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to need less.
Right.
And it's going to actually do its thing. I actually think that, curcumin is a really interesting one. That, there's all this data about lower levels, at least in people who eat a traditional diet in Asia, in parts of Asia that consume a lot of curcumin, having lower levels of neurodegenerative diseases. But, the thing that people don't talk about is, for whatever reason, the researchers honed in on this one thing and said, this is the one thing. But curry involves a lot of other things too.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a really good chance that it's the synergy of all of those things together, with curcumin maybe being a central component of it, that really delivers the results. So I think that both are true.
Mm-hmm.
I think that at the end of the day, it's what can we do to reduce inflammation? And if your house is on fire and you think you're just going to throw a bucket of water on it, no matter how fancy the bucket is, it's not going to put out the fire if you're still feeding it from the other side.
Absolutely.
Right?
A good example is like, the Ozempic gold rush, right? I remember it was probably back in 2014. I think that's like the first time I ever really studied like the physiology and science of the incretin hormones, the GIP and the GLP-1 and all of that. And so these days with Ozempic being such a big thing, I've been kind of recycling a lot of content around, well, here's a bunch of natural ways to naturally, holistically optimize your endogenous GLP-1 signaling, right? And, while some of these basic lifestyle foundations, they might be boring to hear about or read about or listen to a lecture about, but when you actually practice these lifestyle habits and practice these lifestyle behaviors, it's so much more of a rich and deeply fulfilling way of living that has you feeling really good, So
Yeah.
I don't know, there might be a take home somewhere in there.
Yeah, no, there is. I mean, it's just, I think, and look, I'm working with a client right now who the first thing he said to me is, I need to lose weight. I want to take one of these peptides. And I'm like, okay, I'm happy to guide you through that, but not until you've corrected your diet, not until you're sleeping, not until you're exercising, which I feel like his mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I said to him, like, what if you were able to release the weight just by doing these things? Why override? I mean, the truth of the matter is these compounds are powerful and they work, and they've been a godsend for people who are doing everything right, and just their metabolism is so broken from years and years and years of yo-yo dieting or whatever it is, that it actually helps to get the wheels in motion. And I think that the secret sauce for those guys is now, okay, now that you've got the machine working, now what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to take this opportunity to implement the lifestyle, change your diet, do the things so that you can come off them? Or are you just going to make the decision that this is going to be, your crutch
Mm-hmm.
till the end of time? So it's, I think it's a little bit of both, right?
Well, it's all what people want. I'm a big motivational interview kind of guy. It's like, why are they trying to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish? What's their purpose? What's their why? Like, so much of what we actually do is a lot of holding space and reflecting and trying to help people come back to themselves, right? And especially with the subject of mental health, which can be, so nebulous and cryptic to navigate, because it's like, the big thing with mental health, is it, psychological, is it physiological? And it's like, well, it's a complex
Mhm.
mixture of both. So how do you start kind of disentangling that? Because like personally, I'm the kind of live and let live type of guy. Of like, I don't care what drugs or supplements or like, I don't care if it resonates with them, great. But it's all
Yeah.
about, does it work? Is it helping you move closer to the quality of life that you want? And I think there's a lot of kind of, I don't know. It's almost like the chronic disease epidemic is maybe more of a spiritual crisis or something than anything. I mean, I think there's a lot of layers to it.
Mm, yeah. Well, I mean, chronic disease is a funny one, right? I think that, and I definitely think, and you would know more about this than I do, because this is not my area necessarily. I've kind of stayed away from it because it's not my area. But when you're talking about chronic Lyme and EBV, these underlying infections that really plague people, what you often will hear from people is they were managed, and this event happened, and they're right back to square one again. And is it an emotional upheaval or shock that takes down the immune system so that these opportunistic bugs just can rise up and have their way again? Or is it really like a retriggering somehow of the bugs? And I'll bet you that depending on the situation, both can be true.
Mm-hmm.
But to that end, a question for you is, when you're dealing with people who have serious mental health issues, and this is where I think the conventional system really fails. Um, all these people who are dealing with mental health issues, is they, is the try this SSRI, use this, that, and the other thing. I mean, I'm related to someone who for years and years banged his head against the wall. And it was really only recently that he was offered an appointment with a dietitian
Mm-hmm.
who put him on a FODMAP diet, which shockingly had a massive impact on his ability to function.
Mm-hmm.
But it took a cajillion years before that actually happened.
Yeah.
And it needed to be someone else,
Mm-hmm.
right? But in your world, when you're talking about mental health, how often are you seeing, and you talked very poignantly about your fiance or your girlfriend, about how in her case, maybe could it have been repeated concussions layered with some kind of Lyme or other infection, layered with, right, that
Mm-hmm.
created this matrix that presented as this crazy array of symptoms that nobody was really able to untangle at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I guess for people who are listening, who are dealing with serious mental health issues, or who have a loved one who's dealing with serious mental health issues, do you have any suggestions from them of where to look and where to start, maybe, so that they can start to take away the most basic? Because telling someone with a mental health issue, and you would know this way better than me, to sleep better, eat better, exercise, and get outside, you may as well just be poking them in the eye with barbed wire.
Yeah.
Like, they're like, yeah, I know that, and I can't do it, so what do you got, kind of
Yeah.
thing.
There's so much to unpack, which is where literally my whole career at this point, I built an institute and built a curriculum and a methodology that is the Functional Mental Health Practitioner Certificate Program, which coincides with a lab test, lab panel that I developed called the Mental M.A.P, which the idea, because to your point, like I just can't wrap my head around of like, look, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm pretty forthright about that. And I can't wrap my head around how the conventional psychiatric system, they really don't use lab testing at all, right? Like
No.
diagnostic lab testing, established clinical biomarkers, objectively assessing their physiology. I've just never really understood that. And maybe while, 30 years ago, maybe that was a little bit more excusable just because of where the research and technology was. These days, there is no excuse. There just isn't. When you really look into all of the many physiological root cause factors that are going to drive all sorts of dysfunction within the neurophysiology, driving neuroinflammation and oxidative stress, nitrosative stress, dysregulating the neuroendocrine system or inhibiting neurotrophic signaling, all of these very well studied physiological mechanisms that maintain homeostasis in the central nervous system and in the body. And so for me, like when I discovered functional medicine, it just made sense. It just made sense that we would be assessing physiology and exploring root cause factors, some obvious, some not so obvious, and how that's dysregulating the physiology. But then even further, as I, made my rounds through functional medicine, I'm like, man, I see a lot of issues with this industry too, where I see more chasing root causes than tracking physiology. And that doesn't make sense, right? Where like as a hypothetical example, I get all these people that maybe they've been diagnosed with chronic Lyme and MCAS and chronic reactivating EBV and SIRS and leaky gut and mitochondrial, all of these sort of pseudo diagnostic terms, right? Which that can be a problem in itself when we start throwing around scary sounding labels that are not like qualified diagnostic labels.
Yeah.
And then, well, let's do all of this lab testing that when you really look into it is not FDA approved, doesn't have diagnostic value, doesn't have clearly established clinical significance or value, right? So a lot of, functional lab tests, things like urinary mycotoxin testing or HTMA or organic acids or PCR stool testing, the list goes on and on and on. A lot of these functional tests are looking for the presence of something that could be harmful to the body, but they're not assessing the physiological function of the body, right? Like if you pee into a cup and pay $500 of, well, how many mold toxins came out in my urine? That doesn't tell you anything about how those mold toxins are affecting the physiology or biochemistry of the body. And, with the background that I have, when I was kind of going through the functional medicine space, I'm like, well, the conventional model isn't really making full sense. This isn't making full sense. What the hell, right? And so I always preach about how we have to be spending more time tracking physiology than chasing root causes, right? Because it's easy to kind of sell somebody on the notion of, hey, look, you have mold toxins in your urine. Therefore, I'm going to tell you that you have mycotoxicosis. And well, it sounds scientific. It sounds scary. It sounds fancy. I believe it. And that could really be inducing a nocebo effect, right? So I've been preaching about this more and more recently, because especially with mental health, which is the sum of physiological function and psychological function. And so, what do you think happens if you get all of these scary sounding labels thrown at you? You start believing, oh my God, I have all these scary things wrong with me. And a lot of people are familiar with placebo effect, right? Like that's a very scientifically sound established thing of like, okay, you could take an empty capsule, but if you don't know that it's empty and you believe that that's like the best medicine ever and it's going to heal you, you actually are scientifically, statistically more likely to experience perceived health benefit, or even not even just perceived, but like if you tracked biomarkers,
sometimes you
you
experience
actually
benefit.
do see like objective improvements in physiology. And was it because there was any magical medicine in the capsule? No, it was your mindset. It was the power of belief of you believed that something good was happening and it caused something good to happen in your psychology and physiology. Nocebo is the exact opposite. And I would argue that the nocebo effect is one of the biggest root causes in functional medicine that nobody's
Mm-hmm.
talking about, because it's the
Yeah.
opposite. It's if you believe that something bad is happening to you, if you believe that something is hurting you, you're more likely to experience negative symptoms and even maybe a decline in your physiology. And it might have nothing to do with the idea that was told to you. So, you have like a and I'm kind of, I don't know, in some ways, maybe critiquing my professional pool to some extent, but I think we need to raise the bar a little bit because, for example, with chronic Lyme, I think that's what maybe set me off
It's
on this.
it's so nebulous. I mean, it's crazy.
Well, the idea of chronic Lyme, which, yeah, do I think chronic Lyme is a real thing? Yes. But
Hmm.
the phrase chronic Lyme gets thrown around constantly. And the whole premise of chronic Lyme is essentially you're saying you have this chronic inflammatory response that was triggered initially by this, initial acute borreliosis type of infection, right? That's the
Hmm.
whole argument, the whole, theoretical foundation of chronic Lyme. But then I see people getting told they have chronic Lyme, even though they didn't do any clinical testing for
Hmm.
inflammation. It's like, if you can't objectively prove that somebody has any measurable degree of inflammation, you can't diagnose them. You can't tell them they have a chronic inflammatory disorder. And I see too much of that. And that negatively
Hmm.
impacts mental health. So for me, I'm a truth seeker and I like objectivity. And I think we need a lot more objectivity in today's world, and especially when navigating mental health, because we really have to be able to delineate between the psychological healing opportunities and the physiological. And
Hmm.
so a lot of what I try to do, whether it's with a private client or I'm educating my FMHP students, it's not that I have all the answers, but I've at least created a system and a framework that allows us to kind of conduct mini experiments, right? Like, let's collect baseline data. Let's get some kind of intervention program protocol in place, try to control the variables, and let's retest the data. Let's be objective. Let's be scientific about our approach to healing, because otherwise you see people just like losing themselves down all of these sort of theoretical rabbit holes.
Yeah. No, I love that. So what are the tests? I mean, for me, like what comes, some of the things that seem obvious to me that we should be looking at, that too often, to your point, we go to the fancy tests, right?
Yeah.
But have we assessed micronutrient deficiencies, for example, right? Which is, it's back to boring.
Hmm.
Honestly, it's not fancy,
Yeah.
right? It's basic, like it's a blood test, and it's going to look at your essentially your levels of, and even the micronutrients and the little vitamins and minerals that nobody talks about. And maybe we fully understand what they do, and maybe we don't really, but we know that there's not a whole lot in our body or in Mother Nature that doesn't have a purpose, whether we get it or don't get it.
Hmm.
So to me, one of the low hanging fruit that very few people look at is micronutrient testing,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
it's pretty objective.
Hmm.
But what are the tests? What are the tests that you're looking at in terms of, the things that can give you some top line understanding of what are some of the physiological imbalances here that maybe if we help to rebalance these, I see it almost like a domino effect.
Hmm.
Maybe not all the dominoes will fall into place, it will fall down, but you'll get yourself a certain way down the road. And now you can reassess and ask new questions.
Yeah, I mean, this is really where my passion lies. I feel like the lab testing and the clinical biomarkers is perhaps my biggest passion out of everything that I do professionally, because it's like, the intervention, whether it's a fancy diet or a health coaching program or fitness program or peptides or psychedelics, or I don't so much care about what the intervention is that they want to choose to try to improve their quality of life. I care about objectively knowing that we're moving the needle in the physiological systems that needs to be moved, right?
Hmm.
And something that I've kind of noodled on like my whole career is like, okay, so this conventional system, which is huge, multi-trillion dollar, like, so much regulation, so much legality, so much established efficacy. And I mean, what an impressively large regulated system. And it's like, okay, you go see a conventional doctor and they'll just do like a basic blood chemistry panel. You know, it's
Yeah.
dirt cheap. Insurance is happy to pay for it and they don't want to pay for anything non-medically necessary, right? But then you go into the functional world and it's like blood work is not the starting point or the standard. It's all of these exotic, like, well, it's a stool test and it's a hair test and it's a urine test. And it's like, you know, part of it for me is I'm like, if all these tests are so great from like a clinical diagnostic perspective, why are they not used in conventional healthcare? Right? Like it just doesn't make sense to me, you know, if there's something
I
going
mean,
on
in some
there.
case, yeah. Although I think in some cases it's what you just said. It's cost,
Mm-hmm.
right? I do think we need to find, to your point, it's finding that intersection of those tests in the functional space that aren't included simply because of cost, but that can give good insight into other aspects. I mean, I don't think there's any insurance company that's going to pay for a SpectraCell test, right? Which is a
Probably not.
micronutrient test. Most likely. I mean, I don't know your system that well. I know my system won't. I have to beg for a vitamin D3 test here. And
Right.
even if I offer to pay for it, if I don't have a requisition, the lab won't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is pretty basic, right?
When it
I mean,
becomes such a hard thing for patients and clients to navigate, you know, we deal with this every day where, you know, a lot of times people will ask at my practice of like, well, hey, I don't really want to pay for this testing out of pocket. Can I go ask my doctor? And it's like, you can. I don't think you're going to get everything, you know, you need though. But getting back to your original question of, you know, what tests I think are most important to run, primarily blood work. You know,
mhm,
it's primarily going to be well studied, clinically validated biomarkers. And to me, the big buckets, like if we're really trying to assess things that could be contributing to their mental health struggles, you know, there's kind of this mechanistic checkbox that I run through of like number one, neuroinflammation. You know, is there inflammation and or neuroinflammation present? Yet, you know, yes or no, or rather how much, right? Because of course,
mhm,
none of these things are binary. You do or do not have
mhm.
it. It's well, where do you have
To
like a
what
little
degree?
bit of inflammation or a lot of inflammation,
Yeah.
right? And to me, when inflammation is present, that's always like public enemy number one. You know, we can't really
Mhm,
heal or accomplish much until we put out the fire. You know, we can figure out how the fire started later. Right now, we need to put out the fire, right? So neuroinflammation is kind of one of the top things. Neuroendocrine dysregulation is actually more prevalent. So hormone balance, right? Now, this could be
mhm,
more like neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, glutamate, GABA, all the things. But this could also be more steroid hormones. This could be thyroid hormones. This could be incretin hormones. Like, but simply looking at the hormonal, the endocrine component, which is actually, I would argue, a little bit more prevalent than widespread neuroinflammation to an extent.
mhm,
And a lot of times the neuroendocrine dysregulation happens before the fire really starts, if you will. But to your point, nutrient status, right? I mean, nutrient status are arguably like that's so foundational. If your body doesn't have, you know, the right balance of nutrients that it needs to function and do what it knows how to do, and then the neurotrophic status, which you know, BDNF and all the neurotrophic factors that really essentially grow and heal our brain. And what's crazy is there's so many amazing clinical biomarkers through the giant labs, LabCorp and Quest, that are so well studied that we can really objectively assess and track some of these
mhm,
physiological mechanisms. We can track the inflammation or the immune activation or the nutrient status and have, you know, this sort of working data picture to see like, well, where are we making progress? Where are we progressing? Where are we regressing? And then obviously we can supplement with functional lab tests of like, well, let's look at the composition of your microbiome or let's look at some organic
mhm.
acids or so there's definitely a time and a place for everything. But above all else, we have to get a good baseline of their physiology, kind of casting a broad net. And part of it, I'll wrap this monologue up on one point too of a lot of times people, they want a lot of data, they want a lot of lab testing. It's like you don't always need a lot. Like even if we're just starting with like a pretty basic blood panel, we can always dig deeper later. But I think sometimes there is like too much emphasis on, well, I have to do all the testing and get all of the data.
Oh,
And it's
yeah.
like, no, we need to start doing work actually and have some data
Yeah.
points that we can track along the way.
For sure. Well, and then because then you're buried under a tsunami of information and you have no idea where to start,
Yeah.
right? I think the interesting thing about starting with that foundational blood work, I mean, if the hormones are out of whack, if the thyroid's not functioning, I mean, how many people have been put on antidepressants and
Hmm.
had an underfunctioning thyroid, or, for menopausal, perimenopausal, premenopausal women, like how many of them get put on anti-anxiety and antidepressants when really what they really needed was to have their hormones rebalanced.
Hmm. Yeah.
And why not start there, which is really foundational and supports the system, rather than bring in a drug that is going to have other effects downstream that are going to have to be fixed. So um, even blood sugar regulation, and I don't know, I mean, if you're talking about metabolism, you're talking about this, like people who are on this roller coaster ride of too much sugar, not enough sugar, too much sugar, not enough sugar. What if we could flatten that curve and see, do the panic attacks get better? It doesn't mean they're going to stop,
Hmm.
but can it reduce the amplitude of what they're experiencing?
Yeah, I should have even maybe led with that because it goes back to some of what I teach in like module one of my program, where it's simply the paradigm shift. Like yesterday, I was leading a case study call with my FMHP students, and one of my trainees had submitted her daughter as an example, and her daughter was having a lot of issues, diagnosed bipolar type 1, and was having a lot of recurrent manic episodes and even psychotic episodes, right? And so the big paradigm shift now, I'll use myself, just I would rather like talk about myself to
Sure.
not insult anybody, where like, okay, I have genetic predisposition to ADHD and major depressive disorder. That's what I was diagnosed with when I was 21. I've never identified with either disorder. These days I feel pretty healthy, pretty high functioning, medication free. So, did I cure myself? Did I put my mental illness into remission? I have my own attitude towards my psychological well-being, but I just kind of postulate that rhetorically to get people thinking. But ultimately it's like we might not be able to control the genetic predispositions. Now there's a whole conversation we could have about
Hmm.
the rise of neurodevelopmental disorders and sort of the miswiring of the brain, if you will, that happens in utero due to essentially the physiological state of the mother and the father, and how then
Yeah.
you can join that genetic content. And it does, when this brain is developing in utero, we know that the microbiome and the inflammatory status of the mother and the father directly impacts the development of that brain in utero in the fetus, right? But my point being, once somebody is born into the world, while their brain is highly plastic, there's only so much rewiring and remodeling that can be done once it has been formed, once that brain has been developed and that child is born. So, my point being, we can't really do anything about genetic predispositions, whether it's to bipolar or mania or psychosis or ADHD, but we can very much optimize their physiological function and increase their level of functionality, right? So, hypothetically, like what happens if you take somebody with ADHD and, they're gluten intolerant and celiac and they don't know it, or they're breathing in mold fumes, or they're being exposed to heavy metals, or they're hyperglycemic, or all of these things. So it's not that, to your point of like the blood sugar, stabilizing somebody's blood sugar and getting somebody's blood sugar regulation better, it might not get rid of their mental health disorder forever or all of their symptoms, but it's sure going to give them a lot more stability, a lot more functionality, a lot more
Hmm.
quality of life, right? And then, when you actually look into the literature on like, oh yeah, like hypoglycemia actually can trigger manic episodes, right?
Yeah.
So even like that came up in the case study yesterday of, okay, her daughter might always have bipolar predisposition, but we can kind of put it into remission and keep it in remission with the right, functional know-how, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think genetic predispositions are just that. And
Right.
and by knowing what the predispositions, bleh. By knowing, by having any insight into those predispositions might help to guide us and hopefully motivate the individual to raise the bar on their personal care to avoid flipping those switches, because that's what it is,
Mm-hmm.
right? Some people have that switch present, some people don't. Like there's that very interesting stat about young males and schizophrenia and cannabis use.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that every young man who uses cannabis is going to become schizophrenic, but there is that tiny proportion of the population that has a genetic variant. And I don't even like to call them mutations. I prefer to use the word variant because mutations are so negative, but they have that variant that if they knew about it, they can choose not to trigger it.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think that genetics can be used in a couple of different ways. One is they can be used for good, to provide insight and say, okay, like my genetic predisposition to type 2 diabetes, to high blood pressure, to saturated fat is going to drive inflammation in my body. Knowing these things has very much informed, plus looking at the rest of my family.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So everybody ends up with type 2 diabetes. My grandmother died with type 2 diabetes and dementia, probably driven by her type 2 diabetes that wasn't controlled. Like, all of these things. Like it's kind of, you can see your roadmap very often in your family, but then you get your genetic report, you see what you've inherited. And this can very much have a really it can have a very motivational impact on how the choices that you're going to make and the things you're going to focus on, which I think, to your point, all the lab testing in the world, I may not be showing up as having any kind of blood sugar issues. But if I know that predisposition is there, then I'm going to choose to pay more attention to it so that it doesn't declare.
Absolutely.
And that, and that's very, compared to triggering manic episodes and bipolar and stuff like that, it's nothing, right? But it plays out across all of these things. And I think there's even and again, you would know more about this than I do, like even in this world of people really pushing the envelope and doing the research, you have people talking about different nutrient, like micronutrients or amino acids that might be, and they're all very aware that this isn't always going to apply, but is it possible that we're seeing this in this group of people suffering with whatever mental health condition? What have we got to lose to dig in and say, hey, do they have this deficiency? Will it help if we bring this up in their case and help to bring some balance into the system?
Yeah, it becomes a pretty convoluted thing to navigate, because it's like you're trying to map out, their symptoms and their physiology being the sum of all these input signals, right? Because even like vitamin D is a great example where, to your point, vitamin D3, which 25 hydroxy D3 is the metabolite being measured there commonly. And that's one of the more standard, blood tests. Like that's not a super hard thing to get usually, but it's not usually included in a basic routine workup. And even, trying to figure out what some of these biomarkers really mean clinically, where even vitamin D has been shown to be more of an acute phase reactant to inflammation, where, there's all this research that's like, oh, well, all these people with obesity and chronic disease, they all have low vitamin D. And our simplistic mammalian brains, we want to think, oh, well, so if we just give them vitamin D, maybe that will undo all these problems. But in reality, it's like, well, no, the low levels of vitamin D3 in the blood is really a reflection of an inflammatory issue. It's not necessarily a vitamin D deficiency, it's an inflammatory response. And so even like as a clinical pearl, when I assess vitamin D, we do the 25 hydroxy D3, which is what most people are measuring. But then the bioactive form of D3, which is calcitriol or 125 dihydroxy vitamin D3, and you can actually see, like, sometimes you'll have somebody that both levels are low, and that's a little bit more suggesting a bit of an insufficiency or deficiency. So then you bust out supplementation, get outside in the sunlight. But a lot of times too, with more infection or immune activation or inflammation, you'll see, the prohormone 25 hydroxy D3 low, and then the bioavailable hormone is actually high. And that's sort
Yeah.
of more suggesting this conversion, this activation of, well, no, the body is activating the prohormone into the bioavailable hormone to help, fight infection and fight inflammation. And so it's a hard thing for, I think, people to navigate, understanding, what do the tests and the biomarkers mean. But I love the genetic testing, and genetics is the future of medicine, and they're working on CRISPR and gene editing technology and all this crazy stuff. But I think genetics can be very, very empowering, right? Because now it could be fear mongering or nocebo
Yeah.
inducing, right? Depending on
Yeah.
how it's used. It's a double-edged sword. But I'm just all about empowering people with data and education. So that way, again, they are able to be sovereign and conduct their health experiments and see, like, what's really serving them, both physiologically and psychologically.
Okay, so talking about genetic predisposition, like the value of genetic testing and how it can be so, if used for good, it can be so powerful, and if used improperly, it can chop people off at the knees. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Well, like we were talking about earlier, it can be very, empowering and educational and informative, and empower people to just better understand, hey, I have these predispositions. I should probably pay a little more attention to these deeper aspects of my health. Of course, built on the foundation of good lifestyle foundations, right? Not being too myopic about trying to, treat the SNP, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But especially, I think genetics is exciting, and especially with it's starting to become more routine. People are getting these fancy, more like pharmacology, pharmacokinetic genetic tests done of, well, let's test your genes to see what drugs are going to be
Yeah.
compatible, with your genes. And currently today, based on some of the literature I've read, there's over 90 million SNPs that have been identified, right?
Yeah.
And even like MTHFR, which, okay, that's like one of the most popular SNPs. It's one of the best, known, most talked about. Even with like the MTHFR methylation conversation, we're usually only ever talking about the main two SNPs, the 677 and 1298. But actually, research shows as of right now, there's over 14 variants, over 14 SNPs of
Mm-hmm.
MTHFR that have been studied and shown to be clinically significant. Now, how many variations in the MTHFR gene there are, I don't know. Could be a lot. So that's what makes genetics really exciting, is we're just scratching, the tip of the iceberg in regards to all of the different genetic SNPs and variants that might predispose you and give you a higher risk of this or that. But I think when properly employed, it can be extremely empowering to help people just try to optimize their epigenetic health and optimize
Yeah.
their health outcomes.
Yeah. Well, the MTHFR conversation is so interesting because I think that, you have all these people in a panic running around saying, I have the MTHFR.
Mm-hmm.
I have or either I have the MTHFR gene, which I find hilarious because we all have the MTHFR gene. But what they're talking about is, they've either been told they're an overmethylator or an undermethylator. But when I did my training on epigenetics, what I was taught is that, of the huge percentage of people that may show a variation that makes them puts them in the over or undermethylator bucket, only 20% of those people actually present clinically
Mm-hmm.
as an over undermethylator. And what you just said about there are actually 14 SNPs that contribute really speaks to the magical wisdom of Mother Nature, where we've got all these built-in redundancies
Mm-hmm.
in our system. So all these different compensatory pathways that probably are picking up the slack for people, where we're looking at these two SNPs and saying, oh, this is over or under methylation, but maybe there's all these other SNPs in the background going, no, it's good. I got you.
Mm-hmm.
I can make up for that. Like, you're good. Right.
Yeah.
And this goes back to your placebo nocebo effect, where, I think we have to take a deep breath and understand that there's a lot of power in genetics and there's so much we don't know.
Yeah.
And just to, look at your genetics, get a sense of what it means based on what we currently know. And then here's the kicker: check back in with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Is it showing up?
Mm-hmm.
Are you experiencing this, whatever it is you're being told? Because believe and know that there are other backup systems in your body that may be making up for it.
I could not be more grateful that you said that. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, and you might be the first or maybe just one of a few people that's acknowledged that nuance in a very constructive way of the compensatory mechanisms, right? Because while like I love genetic testing, or at least like I want to love genetic testing. I want to love it. I wish it
Yeah.
was as
I'm
simple as
with you.
we could just map out all of your genes and then just create that
Mhm.
fancy protocol that's customized. I wish it works that way, but it doesn't really, right? A number of years ago, I met with a group of researchers, and we were talking about the idea of developing kind of a new test, a new biomarker that was essentially like whole genome methylation status, or global DNA methylation status, right? And kind of the conceptual idea being, out of all of your genetic content, like how much of that is methylated or silenced from like an
Right.
epigenetic perspective. And because even methylation is such a ambiguous thing, where it's like, well, methylation, it's this biochemical reaction going on billions of times per second, every single one of your, 40 trillion cells. So like, this is not something we can
It's
really,
mind blowing, actually.
comprehend, right?
Yeah.
But especially with like over 90 million SNPs identified so far, and we don't know like which ones are clinically relevant or significant, which ones just don't really matter. Right. And so to your point, it makes me think of a specific client that I have. She's been with me for like 3 years now. And she has a history with some medical trauma from her childhood. And then she also has OCD. And OCD is a very special neuropsychiatric disorder. It's a very unique one. A lot of rumination, a lot of hypervigilance and kind of neurotic behaviors and all these things. And she's a good example of somebody that genetic testing and her do not mix well, right? Because then it gives her OCD more things to latch onto and freak out about.
Yep.
And it's like I've done a lot of lab testing on her. I love her to death. She's a good friend, amazing human, love her to death. But it is an ongoing battle where it's the overconsumption of lab data and even stuff that might not even really be significant or relevant to her health, and it ends up hurting her. It's almost like she's taking the clinical tool out of my hands and hurting herself with it, right? So
Yeah.
one of the things we're working on now is actually less lab testing. We need to get away from it. You need to focus on living your life in a way that feels good and is fulfilling, not looking for the next thing that's wrong with you, not keep digging for problems, not looking for, well, what else, is wrong with me, right? That's a very nocebo inducing thing. So to your point, it's all in how it's used, and we really don't know. Like, okay, maybe this one gene has this one SNP that is clinically shown to reduce your enzymatic capacity, and that could be bad for you long term. But to your point, the body with its innate wisdom could have thousands, if not millions, of compensatory mechanisms that could potentially pick up the slack, right? So there is that disconnect between genetic predisposition versus clinical outcome data. And there's a lot that goes on between that. And fortunately, people, humans, self-healers, consumers, patients, clients, they have a lot of control over a lot of those things that then dictate, their clinical outcomes.
I love that. Yeah, no, that is so true. And I think this is actually a good way to kind of move ourselves towards because we have lots of different paths we could explore here, but to move ourselves to a place where we can kind of end this interview and look forward to the next one. And that is that, it's the testing, all the testing that we have, other than, and frankly, even what we know to be true 100%, we may discover something next week that says, oh, well, yeah, but, and, but never forgetting. And I think that for all of us, it's important, but particularly for people who are kind of caught in these loops where mental health is an issue, which really raises the stakes, is having some kind of innate trust in your body's desire to survive. Right? The body's primary objective is keeping you alive. And so if we have trust in that, then, allowing a practitioner such as yourself, or one of the people that you've trained, to help to guide you and understand how much testing do we really need? It's back to the minimum effective dose. Like how little can we do to get the most bang for your buck right now? And maybe later we move into the more advanced stuff, but having trust in yourself and trust in the process, and not getting caught in these labels and traps and overcomplicated processes that, to your point, I remember having a client once who had been told that not only did she have MCAS, but, this whole cell danger response was a massive issue for her. And every time she said cell danger response, I could feel her anxiety ramping up, right? Because just the term cell danger response is panic, and it made me panic. I was like, what does that mean? That's terrible.
Yeah. Sounds scary.
At the time, I didn't know what it was. It sounded really scary. And then if all your cells are in this cell danger response business, you're like, holy crap, I can't help you. I don't know what to do about that. And so not getting caught in these labels that really become drivers, if you will, of a condition that's going to ultimately become much harder to balance or solve.
Yeah. It's kind of where, I'm really glad you brought that up, and it's very refreshing talking to you, because I actually feel like we're speaking the same language and on the same page. That doesn't happen for me that much, to be honest. And the cell danger response is a great, or MCAS or SIRS, or, some of these things. Cell danger response is a great example of is it a brilliant scientific theory with some emerging evidence to say that maybe it's a thing that warrants more research? Yes. Is it a diagnosis? No. Is it something that we can objectively measure and quantify? No. So then what good does it do to label somebody, a normal human, just trying to figure out how to have a healthy, normal human experience? How is it helpful to label them with something that you can't, there's no criteria, there's no diagnostic test, there's no way to measure it objectively. So what good does it do to tell somebody they have cell danger response? And all the while, it's a theory. It's a scientific theory with some research that's starting to emerge that says, hey, maybe the mitochondria regulate this, right? So that's kind of I think, and this is where the truth is usually in the middle, right? Conventional, it's kind of the archaic, crusty, outdated, myopic, reductionistic, get your head out of your ass and get caught up with, research, and maybe some common sense sprinkled in there wouldn't hurt. But then functional tends to be excessively early adopters, kind of too fringe, too on the frontier, where it's we're running wild with, things that are really kind of a working theory. And then that freaks people out, and it scares them. It disempowers them, right? So I think, especially with my background, I have a lot of coaching psychology background. As doctors, clinicians, coaches, practitioners, we have to make sure that everything that we're communicating is going to be psychologically healthy and constructive, right? That's a big part of it. Information can be delivered in a very fear-mongering way, or a very, hope-inducing and empowering way, right? And it doesn't even have so much to do with the data as how it's communicated, how it's delivered. So that's part of it. Humans are more emotional than anything else. So we have to cater to that.
I love that. I love that. Okay. We're, we can keep agreeing with each other. And I think it's time for us to tell people where they can learn more about you, follow your amazing content. And I think you have you have a practitioner training course. Do you also have offerings for the consumer that's looking for help, or maybe a directory to help them find a practitioner? How do people access all your amazing stuff?
Yeah, I appreciate it a lot. I'm not hard to find. Instagram is the main platform, the Holistic Savage, and we've got the website, we've got the podcast that you're coming on very soon. So we
Can't
have
wait.
something for everybody. We've got practitioner training for professionals. We have client services and supplements and tons of free content. So if people follow along on Instagram, they can consume all the content they want, and hopefully
I
it helps
love
them.
it.
Yeah.
Amazing. So Holistic Savage is the Instagram handle,
Hmm.
and the podcast is called
The Holistic
Holistic
Savage
Savage as well.
podcast.
What's that?
the
Holistic Savage
Yep.
Podcast. Amazing. All right. Well, Brendan, this has been as much of a joy as I was thinking it was going to be. And I look forward to chatting with you again real soon.
Likewise,
Thank you
my
again for
friend.
taking the time.
Thank you. Appreciate you.